Thanks, Lynn. Yep, my name is Tina. I am up here to introduce Joe Mattias, Uncle Joe. Um, it's our guest speaker this morning. Um, I grew up hearing stories about him and my dad growing up as missionary kids in Bolivia. And then I ended up working for Uncle Joe for about 7 or so years. And I just got to witness his generosity and care for everyone that walked through his office doors. And I also spent quite a few lunch breaks with him listening to advice and more life stories, but I haven't heard him deliver a sermon yet. So, to be fair though, I think some of the stories that he told might have been about the length of a sermon, but I've yet to hear him deliver an actual official sermon. So, all that to say, I'm just very excited to hear what he's prepared for us this morning and how God's going to use him to encourage us to persevere in difficult times through trusting our God. So, I just want to pray for Uncle Joe. Dear Lord, just thank you for this day today. Thank you for everyone who's here, everyone who was able to take time out of their holiday and just be here to worship you, Lord, come together with fellow Christians and just be encouraged and encourage each other. And I pray that that's what Joe will bring us to, and just take the words that he's been thinking about that have come from you and just give them to us, and that we'll have open hearts and open minds and just have something that will stick out to us and just be able to carry us through the week and just continue to honor you and trust you with our lives, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Tina. So, like she said, my name is Joe Mattias, and I have the privilege to be serving as an elder here at Frontline Bible Church. And so, welcome this last Sunday of the year to my Frontline Bible Church family, and to those who are visiting us, and also to those who are watching us online. Pastor John took off on us, and so he said, Joe, you're one of the elders, you've got to take my spot and come up here and preach. I said, I'm not a preacher. He says, well, Joe, you've got a story to tell. I said, I've got a lot of stories. And he says, I've got a particular one in mind that I think that you should probably share. So that's what I'm going to be doing, is sharing that story. So when I was 18 years old is when I came here to Michigan. Didn't know where Michigan was, didn't know where Grand Rapids was, but I had been accepted at Grace Bible College to be a student here. So I show up here early because I was going to be playing soccer. And one of the things that they told us at Grace Bible College at that time is that you had to find a church to attend, and that was part of the thing. You had to attend a church. So I said, okay, I figured, well, this is the closest one. So being a poor missionary kid, I really only had 2 pair of jeans, t-shirts. I had 1 pair of cords and hush puppy shoes, which are my good shoes, and couple of turtlenecks. I said, I think I'll put on my good clothes, And so I walked to church, and as I walking into church, there's an older gentleman in there in the foyer, and he's greeting people. And I walk into there, and he looks at me, and I'm thinking he's gonna, say hello and how are you doing and stuff. But he just looks at me and he says, "Don't you have a suit?" And I was like, new city, new place. I'm like, I didn't know what to say. I mean, all I did, I just turned around and walked out. And I've never been to a service at that church again, unfortunately, but it's a good church. But so, years go by, and I get married, and to Cheryl, my wife, and we're looking for a church. And my brother says, hey, I'm starting to attend this church. It's called Moline, it's Berean Bible Church of Moline. He says they're building a new church, and they're meeting over here at the Byron Center High School. And I said, okay, I'll go visit. And unfortunately, my wife happened to be in the hospital at the time, so I went by myself. And as I'm walking up the steps to the auditorium there at Byron Center High School, I see this older gentleman standing outside. Not the same one, fortunately. But he's standing there and he's smiling. As I'm walking up the stairs, he looks at me and he said, "Good morning, young man, and what's your testimony?" And I'm like, wow, this guy really is interested in talking to me. And the gentleman was Joe Weinberg. Was one of the founding members of the church here, one of the families. And that was 37 years ago. I've yet to share my testimony. So today will be it. Before I get into talking about my story, my theme today is going to be about, see if I can work this one. The theme that I'm going to talk about today is trusting God completely. And that's going to be the theme that I'm talking about. And we're going to be looking in the Old Testament to a person by the name of Joseph. And part of his story is what we're going to talk about today before I get into my story. So it's Genesis chapter 39 is where the story of Joseph is. But I'm going to be reading some of these passages and just commenting on it, since I'm not a preacher. I just tend to talk. So I'm going to read part of his story and then just comment on it. So the story actually starts in Genesis chapter 37, verse 2. It says, "Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them." So he went out and he told on them. "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him all the more. And he said to them, he says, 'Listen to my dream.' He says, 'We're binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.' His brothers said to him, 'Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?' And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. 'Listen,' he said, 'I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, 'What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?' His brothers were jealous of him, but his fathers kept the thing in his mind." So Joseph had 11 brothers. They weren't all from the same mom, but basically, he's the golden child, is what he is. And saying these things to his brothers, they just weren't very happy to him. So one day his father says to him, and we're going into verse 12, he says, his brothers were out grazing their flocks, and Joseph's dad says, "Hey, go out and check up on your brothers." He says, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." So when Joseph went there, he's looking for them, and he's asking, where can I find them? And he was told, well, they're out grazing their flocks. They've moved from here. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them. But they saw him in the distance, and before they reached him, they plotted to kill him. And they said, "Here comes the dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of those cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." And when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here. Don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from him and take him back to his father later on. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing. They took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat their meal, and they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, He is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And so his brothers agreed. And so, who does Joseph have at this time? All he has, his brothers are against him. They want to kill him. They decide they're not going to kill him. So, next best thing, hey, how about selling him into slavery? You know, so he's going, well, at least I wasn't killed. I'm being sold into slavery. And you're wondering, you know, where the Lord is in this, you know. And what happened to him at that time then? So they sold him to the Ishmaelites. They took him down to Egypt, is where they were going. And so then we look in chapter 39 of what happens. So, you know, you trust in God when others are hurting you. And this is what I'm getting from this passage here. But in the next one I'm looking at is trust in God when life's unfair. And that is in chapter 39. It says, and I'll read that. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. In Potiphar, what we hear, being a captain of the guard wasn't just being like the sheriff here. He was actually Pharaoh's main security guy. So it basically being like either like the head of the CIA or the FBI. I mean, he was pretty much in charge of everything. And so he's sold into slavery, but Joseph is still a slave in Potiphar's home. But what did Potiphar do? You know, how did the Lord work in this? You know, he's still a slave, but what did the Lord do? It says, the Lord was still with Joseph, and he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, everything that he owned, and from the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he had there, the only thing that Potiphar had to worry about was what he was going to eat. So basically, Joseph was charged of everything. So here he is, even though he is a slave, God made it, changed it for him, gave him an easier, if you want to call it life, being a slave, but being in charge of everything. But what happens then? Then we get another thing that happens to Joseph. First, he's sold into slavery. First, they try to kill him. He's sold into slavery. God reaches down, puts him in charge of everything, makes it easier. But then we go on to read. It says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. But then one day, when he went in the house to attend to his duties and none of the household servants were inside, she caught him by the cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants and said, look, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When the master, Potiphar, heard the story that his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. So he took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So here he was accused of something that he didn't do. He goes from the highest place to the lowest place, gets thrown in prison. But it's kind of odd when you read this about where he was thrown in prison, and historians, theologians think that Potiphar probably really didn't completely believe his wife, because the prison that he was thrown in was not a prison for your lowlifes, your murderers. It was actually a prison for all of the officials, high court officials that ran afoul of Pharaoh, that the Pharaoh got disgusted with. So it was kind of like a Club Med type place that he was in. And even then, while he was in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So here again, Joseph was thrown to the bottom, or probably what he felt was the bottom, but the Lord still had him prosper, even though he was in that prison. And then he gets two companions that get thrown into prison with him. It says, sometime later, in chapter 40, it says, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with these two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Now this, a cupbearer wasn't just somebody that just brings wine and stuff like that. He's actually the person that made sure that the Pharaoh wasn't poisoned. So he basically had to taste everything. I mean, this is a high official. It wasn't just, a kitchen servant. Same thing with the baker. He had to make sure that the food wasn't poisoned, it was well prepared. And so for some reason, Pharaoh got upset at them and had them thrown in jail. And after they'd been in jail for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of his own. Now, Joseph, the name for Joseph is dreamer. I mean, that's what Joseph means, it's dreamer. So Joseph, when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were all dejected. So he asked them, why are your faces so sad today? And they said, we both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. And so he asked them, what was the dream? So the chief cupbearer told Joseph, he said, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it was budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, when this happens, Joseph said to him, remember me, okay? And show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. And then the chief baker, when he saw that Joseph had given him a favorable interpretation, he said, hey, I also had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. The top basket was all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. And then this comes the kicker. Joseph had done this thing to this guy, interpreted his dream, thinking that he would put a good word for him with Pharaoh, maybe get out of there. And it says the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So here you are. Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery. 2 years he was here in jail. When we go on, it says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. And Pharaoh had a dream, and no one could interpret it. And so it was 2 years later, and then the cupbearer remembered. He says, oh, Joseph interpreted my dream. So he told Pharaoh, he says, I know a man who can interpret dreams. And he had Joseph come out, and interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And so he told him, and the Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and Pharaoh gave him the dream, and Joseph interpreted. And Pharaoh lifted Joseph up, took him out of that prison, and put him second in command of entire Egypt. So the only person that was higher than Joseph was Pharaoh. By that time, it says Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So we're talking when he was 17, when he was sold into slavery. By the time he got taken out of prison, he's 30. So people think that that's about, good 12 years of ups and downs and having to trust the Lord during all that, even though when life is unfair, when these things happen to him, he kept on trusting the Lord, and things seemed like it was going up, and then they go down. So what he had to do? He just had to trust the Lord. And that's one of the reasons why I really like the story of Joseph. Here's a man that life, wasn't, wasn't completely fair to him, but God ended up making it all good for him. And that's not always going to happen, but with him, and it might not happen right away, took a long time for Joseph. So what I came in with these conclusions, basically, Joseph, he trusted God when he was betrayed and sold into slavery, okay? When he was falsely accused and while he waited for years in jail. And God proved faithful in every step of the way. And that's the same God back then as it is today, because God is unchanging. God is God. He doesn't change. And, I was thinking about this when Pastor John asked me to share my story. I told Pastor John, I said, I'm not a preacher. I can't do all these points like you do and that. And he says, but Joe, he says, just think about it. So I did, and I just felt the Lord put it on my heart that I could share the story. I have 3 children that the Lord gave my wife and me. We couldn't have children, so we were fortunate, and we were able to adopt 3 precious children. In the state of Michigan, if you have siblings, they tend to place them with the same adoptive parents. So that happened with 2 of our children. Got a phone call a couple years later after the second one we had, and they said, are you Emily's father? I said, yeah. I said, there's another child that has been born, and it's her brother. Do you want to take him? And I said, of course. So the day after, baby was only 2 days old. We went to the hospital, brought this child home. Named him Jacob. Had him in my arms for a week. Cheryl was working, so I would take care of him. And for those of you who've had a brand new baby, you know what it's like. Doesn't matter how you get them, whether adopted or they're your own. It's your child. About the 10th day, get a phone call from the sheriff. They said, you've been accused of molestation. And I'm like, what? You need to bring your child back. And I'm like, I can't bring it. I took him back. Never saw him again. think about him, I pray for him. But God knows where he's at. Really hurt my daughter because she was old and that was her birth brother. And then the world fell in on me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where this accusation came out of. And through it all, I didn't think about God. I didn't think about praying. Because I'm the type of person that fixes things himself. I'm the one that tends to micromanage, to say this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it. And not necessarily let the Lord be involved in it. Yeah, the Lord is there. I pray. But I'm going to do it. So got a lawyer. Went to fight this. And it came down to where they said, you know what? We'll let you have a plea deal. You can either get a first degree, or if you decide to plea, we'll give you a 4th degree misdemeanor. And I looked at my wife and I said, you know, my shoulders are big enough. I think I'll take this plea. My shoulders are big enough for this. Did not even put the Lord in the equation. So I did. I pleaded to a 4th degree misdemeanor, sexual misdemeanor. And and when I did that, then they took my children. They interviewed them, even the smallest one, and they tried to get them to say things, and they still remember this, say things about me that had not happened. Not only there, but not at just CPS, but also in school. Teachers pulled them aside and pretty much tried to coach them to say things. And fortunately, I thought, hey, I'm going to get the transcripts of all that stuff that CPS did of what my children said. But the hardest thing in my life was going and standing in that courtroom and pleading guilty to something which I did not do, and thinking that I could handle it without God. And even though I was handling it without God myself, I could see when I look back on it how God was still taking care of me and my family. Standing in there and having sentence pronounced on me, and it was going to be at least 2 years in jail. It was going to be, I had to be away from my family for 3 years. And I was standing there, and I had, my brother was there, my pastor was there supporting me. And the judge was reading the sentence, and then he said, well, he's okay. He can stay home with his kids, even though the prosecutor says, well, he has to. And then fortunately they had the transcript from all the interviews they did with our children, and the judge says, no, he doesn't have to do that. He can stay home. And then he also said he doesn't have to pay any fines, and those are waived. And it's like, went downstairs when that was done and went to see my probation officer, and he looks at the paperwork and he says, you haven't paid your fines. I says, I don't have to. He says, if you don't pay your fine, I'm going to violate you, which means you're going to jail. He says, you got to pay those fines. I says, no, the judge said I didn't have to pay them. He says, this never happens. He says, in your situation, you pay those fines because that's what's required. I says, no. So my wife actually had to go all the way back up in the courtroom while he was in session with something else and get a written paper from him saying I didn't have to pay those fines, and came down and he said, I've never seen this before. It just doesn't happen. And so I was pretty devastated after that, even though it had to start they threw me on the sexual offenders registry. I couldn't go to school. I couldn't go to my children's events. I had to stay away from that. I was on a 3-year probation, couldn't leave the state of Michigan. Had to report every month to my probation officer, and then I had to report every 3 months. And then the state of Michigan decided to change the punishment on everyone that had a 4th degree even after that, which made it even harder for me to go out. And I remember the school principal giving me a call and said, Joe, just wanted to give you a heads up. If you even walk by the school, I got to call the sheriff to arrest you. And I was like, well, she didn't have to do that. And I'm glad that she gave me a heads up, because I used to drive by that school where my kids went. So I wasn't even allowed to even drive by it. So all during this time, you know, it just really got into my health. I had to start taking antidepressant medications. I got diabetes. I put on tons of weight. It's just, you know, I had to fight to keep my license for my business. It was just going to heck. And I remember just sitting there and, you know, asking why. And sometimes saying, you know what, I think I'm just going to end it. I got enough life insurance that my kids will be taken care of. I think that's just it. You know, I can't handle this. I'm not going to live like this. And, you know, my shoulders really aren't that broad. And came to church that Sunday, and John said to me, he says, Joel, when are you going to get involved in church again? When are you going to start doing, you know, things? And I said to him, I said, I can't. I said, the well's dry. I said, you'll be lucky if you see me in 10 years here. And took me home. And then I said, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I got to trust the Lord. I just got to put it on him. I can't do this anymore. I'm going to put it in the Lord's hands. And that's where I left it. I just couldn't handle it myself anymore. It didn't get better right away, I'll tell you. But I did feel peace about it. I felt I'm fine. And then years later, I was told, you know what, you should try to clear your name. And I'm like, you know, I'm fine. I can do these 25 years. I'm fine. I don't need to do that. You know, I'm fine with the Lord. I put it there. But had a lawyer talk to me, and he says, Joe, we can clear your name. We can just, you know, let's just go and take care of this. We can clear your name. We can find out that those accusations were baseless. I said, okay. It was 18 years after this that I was able to get my name cleared. And it only took a year to do it. And I did not try to do it myself. I just left it in the Lord's hands. And it's still tough to trust the Lord and put it in his hands. It really is. Even though something like this great happened, you know, on a daily thing, it is a daily thing. Walk with the Lord, you know, put it in the Lord's hands. It's what has to be done, though. You got to trust in the Lord. You got to take that leap. So that's why I like the story of Joseph. I like the story because even though he was doing well and doing great, and he went through all these things, the Lord was always there, even though he couldn't see it sometimes. And so it's a really tough thing to do. One of the things that I had to learn when to rappel when I was in the Marine Corps was they taught us how to rappel, and it was on a 60-foot tower. And when you rappel, you grab the rope, but you're holding onto the rope as you're walking down that wall, 60-foot wall. And I hate heights. I hate it with a passion. You're not going to get me up on a roof unless I absolutely have to. But then they told us something else. It says, you also have to learn how to jump out of a helicopter. I'm going, what? And they says, well, the difference between rappelling and jumping out of a helicopter is when you're rappelling, you've got that rope around your waist. You're holding onto the rope so you can feel that you've got some security there as you're walking down the tower. But to learn how to jump out of the helicopter, they have something, and they call it, Marine, excuse the language, but they call it the H-hole. And it's a square thing, and it's 60 feet up there, and you go there, and you stand with your toes there, and the rope is coiled next to you. And so you don't have any support, and then you're just supposed to jump. And I'm like, there is no way I'm going to jump. So I heard my sergeant behind me, you're either going to jump in 3 seconds or I'm going to kick you off. You know, it's like, and he didn't say it that nicely though. And I just, you know, you just take that step of faith. And you take that step of faith and you jump. And you feel that it's empty, but then that rope catches you. And that's what the Lord does when you trust in him. You need to take that step. And so that's kind of where I'm leaving it with you today. And so my challenge for you today, you know, in the story of Joseph and the story that I had to tell, which is really tough to tell because I really don't share that much. I tell a lot of stories, but sometimes not that personal. I said, so the challenge is, you know, whatever you're struggling with today, don't matter how bad it is, go to that ledge. Doesn't matter that you're afraid of what's down there. Take that step into the emptiness because the Lord's going to catch you. He's going to catch you. So take that step. Thank you for listening to my story today.